Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Revenue Optimists. We're a space where go-to-market leaders and revenue operations folks can really come together to learn from one another in order to grow their businesses. My name is Dave Nelson, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Derrek Young, who's the Senior Manager of Global Go-to-Market Operations at Zendesk. Derrek, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, this is great. I'm excited to be part of this podcast that you guys have going on.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about your background and maybe a little bit more about Zendesk?
I've been in sales operation for the past 7-ish years now, right? About some different companies, some a lot smaller, some medium-sized, and currently at Zendesk, which is significantly larger than other companies I've been at. Zendesk, we are a support platform, right? Support ticketing platform. Anytime you see a little chat bubble on like a retail store saying, "Do you need help?" That's probably Zendesk.
And Zendesk is big. What size are you guys at now, and where are you primarily focused?
We're close to 10,000 employees almost, right? We're based in San Francisco. Yeah, it's funny because then Zendesk's been around for like so many years now. We were public and now we're not, right? So we kind of gone through the paces of basically almost everything a tech company can go through.
I was going to say, so that's fantastic because you've been through a roller coaster. So I think you started a long time ago and you've grown to the point where now you're global. Like you said, you were public and now you're private. So I'm sure you've gone through just huge projects and transformations in terms of revenue operations to prepare and to make those transformations.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's like, I think the biggest hurdle was kind of like, the strategy from going public back to private, right? Because when you're private, you are kind of reporting to a different board at that point, right? And then from that point, you have to make a lot of changes, kind of, make them happy, and strategy just shifts really, really fast, right? And decisions need to be made really quickly as well. So from an operations standpoint, it could get quite chaotic.
I can only imagine at that scale, that's a whole different ballgame, right?
Yeah.
Like to do that with a small business with a few sales reps, one thing, but to do it when you're 10,000 employees, that's a whole nother
Yeah,
ballgame.
for sure. And it's funny because like coming from smaller companies, right, when we're always so nimble and we could do things really quickly, right? Yeah, when you're at a certain scale, right, at a company, like you still want to be nimble, but don't realize, there's going to be a lot more down the line impact, right, of any little things you do. So
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know, okay, right now it is thick into territory planning season.
mhm.
We're coming up to the end of the calendar year. So I think a lot of businesses are starting planning for the next fiscal year as well. How do you start? How do you come into that? What do you recommend to others when you're going into that kind of planning session?
So we heavily loop in, like people operations, right? You understand what the potential headcount's going to be at, right? We loop in finance, you understand, okay, what is the, forecasted, goals for next year, right? And we got to loop in our strategy team to tell us, okay, like from a strategy standpoint, like what are we going to be focusing on for this year, right? Focusing on more partner sales or focusing on more enterprise sales or focus more on the SMB space, right? Depending on what the focus is would heavily impact, how we actually carve these territories out, right? To the proper headcount that we are expecting to get as well.
I believe it. Yeah. Okay, so once you have that defined and you've worked with the teams, and I get to work with finance and whatnot too, and you know that your focus is now going to be on, let's say, commercial, and it's going to grow by this amount, sort of thing. What's next? What's the step that you take after that once you start to dig in?
Yeah, I mean, like let's say for in your example, like let's say okay, the company says we want to, go towards more commercial space now, right? Then we got to understand, okay, what does that commercial space look like? How is it defined, right? Is it defined by a certain employee range? Is it defined by, a parent hierarchy basis, right? Is it defined by, certain industries, right? So to get to that nuance and that kind of that pool of customers or profit that you want to target, right? The data that you have in your system is very important as well, right? You want to make sure that, like, okay, like let's say you have a global alignment on how you define commercial space, then let's make sure, okay, how do we get all that data into Salesforce when you start planning for it and carving out that, that space, right? And then having strong, accurate data that your team can utilize will be vital for that.
Yeah, I can imagine. You want that source of truth kind of thing.
Mm.
We hear so often that there's companies and sales reps, sorry, that will come and say, hey, I found on the internet that there's this company's actually this size, so it should fall into my territory and whatnot. How do you kind of handle that? What's the approach at the beginning of the year when you're going through that planning, and how do you decide on what that revenue
Yeah,
is?
it's funny that we're talking about the whole, uh, data and reps coming back saying, okay, oh yeah, I saw on the website this employee count is this, so it should be coming in that space. Like I feel like every company I've been at least has gone through that issue, right? Salesforce data is never going to be 100% clean. It never is going to be, right? I used to think that okay, we could clean ring up and it will stay clean. Never stays clean. But I think the most important thing for that is have a really strong rules of engagement for the team, right? Have a globally aligned sources of truth on okay, like let's say we are going to just use DMB, right, as our source of truth from now on as a whole company, right? I don't care what any website says. I don't care what any tool says. I don't care what LinkedIn says. If DMB says this, that's what we're going to go with, right? So
That's
it
your
really
kind of
depends on
line in the
how.
sand.
Exactly, right. So it really depends on how your company wants to define that, right? It probably isn't going to be accurate, but hey, if that's how you're defining it, right, it makes it very clear for sales and other team members say, okay, well, it's black and white, right? If DMB doesn't say it, then we're not going to go with it, right? So that kind of helps kind of alleviate a lot of those noises.
I believe that. Yeah, I remember talking to someone else and them saying that you can't always be fair. Fair is going to be different for every person based on their perspective, but at least you can be consistent. And
Yeah,
that as long as you're consistent, then people should understand why those decisions were made, kind of thing.
exactly. I agree with that.
Okay, so you picked your line in the sand. You've enriched with that data source. I'm guessing that you're kind of going through that right ahead of planning. Is that right, or is that something that you're kind of constantly doing or have done in the past?
In an ideal world, you companies should be constantly enriching, right? Constantly, cleansing Salesforce and making sure the data is up to date, right? Sometimes, it's hard to do that when we don't have it when the companies have the resources for it. So I've been in companies where we would basically do a massive refresh, right? So we basically have like, okay, we're going to refresh our Salesforce with up to date data from DMB or whatever sources that we have, right? And then we kind of start building like territories in the sandbox to kind of reflect, okay, this is what it will look like, right, with the new up-to-date stuff that we have from DMB, right? And then we see, okay, like all these accounts are going to be shifting to this territory. Now we can start kind of like playing around with, okay, what kind of territory rules make sense? How do we divvy up the proper amount of book of business for each rep, right? Depending on what headcount we have, right? Are we sure they're going to make a certain amount of quota for each region, right? Given what finance is going to give us, right? So a lot of that actual like carving part of it, right? It's just playing around with different books of business, different kind of segmentation, different rules, right? And kind of working with the frontline managers as well, right, on the sales team to understand, okay, based on what you know of your team, right? How do you want to divvy these up for your team members? What makes the most sense, right? Do you want more for this rep or that rep? Do you want more for like this region or that city, right? So it really kind of it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of playing around. It's a lot of analysis, right? But to your point, once the data is clean and there, right, then it's going to be a lot more of the deeper dive into the actual carving aspect of it.
Yeah, I bet. Oh man, I got so many questions here. We could spend the whole hour on this. Okay, so you've drawn your line in the sand. You pick kind of a source of truth. Now, at a company of a certain size, that's probably fine. Now, I'd imagine at Zendesk, you guys are global. You probably have more than one data provider just because of the regions that you're operating in. How
Yeah.
do you add on that layer of complexity to enrich these accounts that are in a geography that somebody might not cover?
Yeah, no, I mean that's always a pain point, right? Is that like every year, every country has like a new tool that they want to implement because it's better for their country, right, or better sources of truth for them. And I completely understand, right? It's like a tool that works well for the U.S., right, doesn't mean it will have any kind of match rate for a country like China or Japan, right? Based on like just character differences and naming conventions, right?
Oh yeah, good point.
Yeah, so for those like countries with like special needs, it's like we need like to really know from kind of like the ground team there to understand, okay, like what is it that you guys actually use, right? That you think you guys would trust, right? Okay, let's say we get funding for it and we get it implemented, right? Then this is going to be sort of true for this country. So your ROE goes from like, okay, this is just DMB, right, to listing out every single country and their ROE and their source of truth for each country as well, right? So when you do it from an actual enrichment standpoint, right, you have to kind of really build in country by country specific rules and using what tools into that. So it does get more complex, but hopefully when the company gets to a larger size, you have the resources to kind of maintain those larger scope of enrichment tools as well.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So then you're picking, so by country, if you've picked Brazil or whatnot, then any account that's created from Brazil is now going to use that data provider, whatever you've chosen as that line in the sand, that source of truth, versus the other countries are going to use your other data providers.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, that's great. And I think that can be a big help because I know there's companies at every different size, right? Some that have done that for years, some that are just getting big enough that that's become a problem.
Yeah, and it's not just by like country as well, right? Because there's like different segments, right? So some data providers are better for the SMB smaller space versus some tools are better for enterprise space, right? So you could really get into the nuance of even like for specific industries and specific sizing of companies and potential prospects, right? So it depends on how far down the rabbit hole a company wants to get into it.
Okay, so now you've got your source of truth. You've cleaned it up, so you've enriched based on the countries that you're in. What's next? I know that a lot of companies are struggling with like duplicate records and whatnot, mergers and acquisitions, that sort of thing. How do you guys manage that, or how do you recommend managing that for everyone else?
My recommendation for a lot of people is that like you really need to define at a global level, what constitutes as a duplicate, right? First, like how do you define a customer and how you define a duplicate customer, right? Once you have that global sense of like, okay, how you define everything, right? Then it makes it easier to have conversation with sales and there are people who own these accounts saying, hey, these are the aligned, rules. We need to merge these accounts, right? And you actually start building rules and kind of automation around like, okay, when these types of accounts come in based on these rules, right? Either they don't get created or they get merged instantly to whatever the master rule we set is, right? Because then when it comes to cleaning up duplicates, right, the first thing you got to do is basically prevent the clutter from coming in the first place, right? You can clean up stuff all you want, but if you don't prevent stuff clutter from coming in, you're constantly having to clean it up, right? So I strongly believe that setting up those global definition is kind of the key for success, right? And then once you kind of get alignment there, right, then merging customer accounts, merging prospect accounts, and kind of doing all that will be a lot easier, than forward.
I believe it. Yeah, absolutely. Once everyone's clear that two of the same company, one that's the marketing department and one that's the sales department, probably doesn't constitute another account, but the one with a different address may constitute a separate account that you need both.
Exactly. Yeah, because I tell people all the time that like the actual pushing a button, cleaning a duplicate is not hard, right? The hard part is getting alignment between two different reps or two different sales teams that, hey, yours is a duplicate, yours is not, right? And they'll kind of go back and forth and fighting all the time on, no, this is the master one. Oh, no, this is a separate marketing team that needs their own, separate license counter contract, right? So there's going to be all these conversation that needs to take place, right? If you are trying to get rid of someone else's book of business and give it to someone else. So that's kind of the hardest part when it comes to duplicate, in my opinion.
Okay, so we talked about the enrichment and we talked about cleaning up the data. Now, I know a large part of your strategy, but every company that gets to a certain size is going after big, large enterprise businesses where they constitute more than just one account, that they have subsidiaries, they have accounts that are in different geographies, different countries, et cetera. How do you guys manage that? How do you suggest for others to go through and make sure that the data is accurate and that you're providing either the entire tree to a sales rep or not, depending on the go-to-market?
It really depends on the strategy and the definition that the team wants to use and have it globally aligned, right? So for example, like you could use the global ultimate as like the parent, right? Or the domestic ultimate. So it really depends how you define a parent right? And what really helps is basically how you define a customer in the first place. You kind of make those decisions, right, from a company-wide standpoint, right? Because how sales define a family tree should really align with how finance would define a family tree as well, right? From a building
Interesting.
standpoint,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
That almost never happens, but then it does cause conflict when it doesn't happen, right? So how a company defines a customer to me is like, really the crutch and the basis of, I think, what needs to be aligned on before you actually have better reporting on these things. But we're going to focus mostly just on a sales standpoint, right? If let's say, for example, we focus on, okay, we want to define it as domestic ultimate as, the parent, right? Then at that point, okay, so if we focus on domestic ultimate as a parent, how many layers you want to get deeper into it? Do you want to be like a flat, everyone just reports to just one parent? Or is there like, multiple layers of hierarchies underneath that as well, right? And if it does, how does that define how you assign this family tree out, right? Is it because after a certain amount of layers, it goes to a different rep, or this one rep owns everything, right? So there's all these nuances and questions that needs to be answered, right, by a company before you actually start implementing it into a territory rule or a territory patch, right? But yeah, there's like we could go on and on about these kind of things just because there's so many nuances that's involved when you talk about hierarchies. So
Oh, I bet, absolutely. And so I guess, do I understand it correctly that, so you want to go through that definition, and then is it a kind of a blanket rule, or is it case by case depending on the type of business and whether or not you use that global ultimate or the domestic ultimate for
yeah,
the assignment?
no, I mean, again, it really depends on the strategy of the company, right? It's easier when you're globally line. Okay, we're only going to use domestic, or we're only going to use global,
Sure.
right? When you use global, just know that it's going to be a little more tricky because you're going to have cross-regional selling at that point, right? Because in a global ultimate could live in, in the UK, but they have branches over in the US, right? So do you sell to both at that point, right? If so, then you have to make sure that this rep is capable of selling to all these different global regions, unless you want to split that up into different, reps as well, right? So um, it gets more complex, right? And my train of thought is, when it comes to ops, simpler the better, right? If we could like have it as simple and working well, right, and defined properly, right, that makes it easier for everybody and less strain on the system. Versus like if you have like overly complex hierarchies with multiple team members working on the same hierarchies, right? Then okay, how does the overlay work? How does the compensation for these work? How does the quota split work, right? Then it kind of becomes a whole mess of things that could break, and you need teams to kind of maintain and keep track of. So
Sure. Yeah, a nightmare for the operations team. I can imagine that there's probably a differing of opinions though between, you're right, keeping your life easier and the operations team and compensation and territories and whatnot, versus the sales leaders who strongly believe one way or the other, that
exactly.
somebody wants to own the entire tree, including Japan and whatnot, versus others saying, no, like there's a whole different approach to selling in Japan versus North America. So let's split them up.
Yeah, yeah, and then that's what I think most companies stick with the domestic, right? So you have like within the country, what is the parent, right? So
Okay.
you don't have like people kind of cross-line across different countries, just because it's even like a language barrier is going to be an issue for these, right? So, but you probably don't have the same maybe connection, right, to the global parent as you do to the domestic parent, right?
Yeah.
So there's pros and cons to both. So I completely understand why things would get a little more complex and why it's more ideal from a selling standpoint. Um, but again, it really depends on are we doing this for the whole entire world or just certain patches around the world, right? So
Right. How does that impact? Because I can imagine you're exactly right that there's nuances. There's probably just the fact that you have sales reps in some countries and you don't in others, right?
mhm.
But how does that impact your kind of reporting and whatnot and strategies and deciding, how well are we performing against these large global businesses when you've broken
Yeah,
it up by like domestic?
I mean, let's assume your data is accurate in Salesforce, your hierarchies are very accurate in Salesforce, right? Then it's easy to kind of put all those parenting into Salesforce with the Salesforce native parent fields, right? Kind of view your family tree, or you use Traction Complete, right? To kind of like view your family tree. Um, And then that kind of gives you the sense of, okay, our whole entire book of business for this hierarchy sits right here, right? And you kind of compare it to the other ones, right? I think the hard part is, well, let me take a step back there. Most companies won't do like a global ultimate for the whole world, right? They'll pick and choose certain accounts that they want to do
Gotcha.
global for, right? These would be more of the strategic accounts, right? So these, are more handpicked and maybe like, less than 50, right? In the whole org will be picked for these. They don't make it easier for a reporting standpoint because you just have like 50 account names, right? And all the family tree underneath them. And then from a territory standpoint, you can basically pluck these out from the analysis, right? And then like manually kind of assign it to a certain group of reps that's only be working these accounts, right?
Yeah.
So that makes it easier from a planning standpoint.
Gotcha. Okay. Nice. And so once they've done that and they've plucked them out and they made that decision, how are you reporting on it? Are you reporting based on what's been plucked out and then kind of aggregating it together, or are you still able to report across like, hey, how are we selling into Cisco or whatnot? It's a massive global firm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on how deep you want to get into the reporting of it, right? I think it depends on how a company wants to define these global ultimate accounts, right? If we're treating them all as enterprise, then from a segmentation rule, okay, like are we including these into the enterprise numbers, or are we treating these as a separate number completely, right? So let's say Cisco, right? Let's see, we want to see how well we do with Cisco. Okay, well, from a family tree of Cisco, how many closed ops and open ops do we have currently with them, right? How many actually are being worked on, right? Are we only like kind of having the opportunities at the global level, or are these opportunities kind of selling from different branches as well, right? So you kind of really understand from like, you got to work with these strategic reps, right, to understand, okay, how are you kind of getting into them? Which people are you talking to, right? Like, do you think they're going to expand downstream, or are you going to like basically go upstream with your expansion, right? And then a lot of these larger companies would have different buying centers as well, right? So you probably would have like multiple different conversations at once, right? Hence why I was saying, from a finance and accounting standpoint, right? How do they want to define a customer? Do they define a customer from buying and cost centers, right? Because it'll be built on different contracts at that point too. But ideally, if your data is clean in Salesforce, you could view it from a hierarchy standpoint pretty easily and have like a roll-up number. If you can, right? Like this whole entire hierarchy have this many potential, open opportunities right now, right? And kind of forecast it that way. And then once you start buying, you have, okay, Cisco total in entirety has, total ARR of this much, right? Not just from Cisco headquarters, but from other branches as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've talked all about data. We've talked about enriching, making sure that you've got global coverage and that line in the sand. We talked about cleaning up the data. So now when it comes to the territory planning season, how do you approach carving it up, right? Making those decisions in this complex go-to-market that you guys have?
I mean, we can even take a step back a little more on like, the scoring part of it, right? That we haven't got much into yet, right?
Sure.
Because then like, depending on how a company wants to score, territories, or different ways to score it, like do we base off, like propensity and willingness to buy on customers, right? Do we have that kind of data or firmographic for that yet, right? Are we tiering these accounts, right? Some companies like they want to tier accounts based on, oh, these are going to be high value clients, and then kind of like tier them lower and lower and lower, right? So depending on those scoring and the tiering, right, on whatever rules the company wants to apply, you kind of work with your sales managers or sales leaders, right? Saying, hey, like, this is the pool of, high value accounts, or these are the pools of like high propensity accounts, right? That fits in the different patches, like you tell us, how do you want to break these up? Do you want to break it up by industry, like certain industry, like a rep will just focus on these industry accounts, or do we want to go down to like I was saying, like zip codes, like do you want to kind of do a more zip code based routing rule, right? So it's a lot of back and forth on what makes the most sense, right? Because ideally these quotas kind of roll up to one manager, right? So it's kind of on them to kind of know what's best for him to hit his target, and for his team to hit his target as well, right? Because if you just do strictly zip code, right, whoever gets like middle of nowhere America versus like someone who gets like the Bay Area, right? Just being unfair at that point, right? So, there's going to be a lot of nuances on how a rep and sales ops work together to kind of break these up and kind of like accurately, place things where it's all fair for like everybody.
Gotcha. Okay. And so when you're going through that process, and I'd imagine it's changed over time, right? When you were smaller, it may not have been at the zip code level. Now that
Yep.
it is, how do you look at, or what is the grading or scoring technique that you recommend? You mentioned tiering accounts. What does that look like? And how do you make sure that they're even, or try to at least?
Best way to go about it is depending on the product fit, and what your process or your ideal customer base is, right? That'll be your scoring model right there, right? Let's say, okay, for company A, okay, we know that the automotive companies are going to be our top targets, right? They're the one who are buying most contracts from us, right? Then these are any automotive type industry companies going to be like tier one, right? Or we could even say, okay, from an automotive standpoint, which one are actually like service centers and which one actually dealerships or actual headquarters, right? Then you start scoring it that way, right? And where the buying center is located, right? Which one has the more buying power, right? So you start kind of getting nuance as to, okay, you have your industry, your ideal customer fit. Okay, now you have to know where the buying power sits as well, right? Then these would get tiered as number one, right? These would be like the high value ones that are going to be easy for you to go in and sell, right? Versus like, okay, if our main target is automotive companies, right? But then also we find like, airline companies or even like boat companies that have a similar use case for it, right? Then we could have, maybe a tier two for these kind of companies, right? So to me, at least, right, that should be what is based off is basically your ideal customer fit and kind of go off that way and seeing what the customer base is, right? Obviously, I'm using a very simplified example here for that scoring, right? But that's kind of how we've done it at the companies I've been in the past.
I find a lot of people love learning by example and like seeing what others have done because you've probably gone through progressions or tried stuff and it didn't work or whatnot, and then gotten to a point where it did. Any examples on what people might be able to use for how to score an account? Right. I think I heard you mentioned a couple things there. There's tiering. So it might be scoring based on industry. I would guess that other methods would be like whether there's an open opportunity, whether there's a closed won opportunity or not. Because I can imagine that as a sales rep, I'd probably want a mix of some existing customers in my territory that I can go and sell more to, but not all existing customers, because you don't want it to feel like you've saturated your entire territory. You don't have the opportunity to sell anymore. But yeah, any examples you have for how
Yeah.
you go about
I mean,
scores?
if you're gonna look at like historical, right, on existing customers as well, right, that's another great way to start tiering and see, like I said, open opportunities, open sales cycles is a great way to tier, right? And then the other one is kind of looking at expansion rate over the past few years as well, right? And so you have an account that's been like expanding year after year after year with you guys, right? Then they have a high propensity to actually buy again for next year, right? So if you use like expansion score as well, right? Some companies would kind of calculate that out based on historical bookings and renewals and expansion that they have over the past few years, right? Goes back to the whole hierarchy as well, right? If you have a hierarchical family tree that keeps buying because they have more branches coming up every single year, right? Then that hierarchy or that family tree, it's a pretty high tiering, right? Or a pretty high scoring, family tree and account, just because they're growing, they're expanding, so they buy more from you guys as well to kind of help compensate for that, right? So looking at these historicals is, it's probably the easiest, right? Just because it's almost like for sure that, oh, they're going to expand, because they keep growing, right? But sometimes you might not get lucky, or they might get lucky, or the economy turns bad, right? And then they stop expanding, right? But looking at the historicals for how much a company expands is usually like pretty good. And then you have let me think what else there is. There's also companies who you see are on the decline as well, right? Then you would tier these as a little bit lower, right? Like they're slowly kind of contracting their contracts year after year. Just you can see their product use cases going down, right? Then you could kind of expect that to happen. The other
I know, I love that. I love what you're saying, because the more data you have, the better. How do you
exactly.
actually then look at that? Are you running reports historically, and do you have a secret sauce for a grade on how you would score that to say, okay, their contract values come down year over year, so now proportionally or something, I'm going to decrease their grade? Or what does that look like if you're, when the rubber hits the road for someone who's got to come in and create the scoring rules,
Yeah.
how they might be able to learn from that?
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a tricky one. Like, I again, every company does it very differently, but from if you see a company kind of contracting and churning a little bit more year after year, right? It's the same as the expansion score, right? You kind of take like the average decline year over year. I think you want to get more granular into it. The best way to do it is looking at the product use cases, right? So hopefully, a company would have a good product team to kind of track the usage of, okay, how much data or licenses this client is actually using year after year, right? And kind of track that product use case decline. And you can kind of suspect, okay, from this year's decline of usage, right, we can expect them to go down this much, right? And then like
Mhm.
from based on previous year's decline as well, right? But again, that's really product based, right? Depending on what kind of product is selling and how much data they're tracking in the product itself for each customer.
So you go through this exercise, you're right in the thick of it now, you've cleaned up your data, you've enriched with the line in the sand so you can decide which segments these fall into. You've kind of scored the accounts or decide on the tiers. You've broken them into these zip codes or whatever level you're at.
Mm-hmm.
How do you then set up your assignments? Like when you actually assign to people, is it automated rules? Is it a data load? And what happens when a new account comes in that you may or may not have, let's say that you don't have in your
Yeah.
environment, that falls into that?
The size of the company really matters, right? I've been at small companies where we just manually assign everything out, right? We don't use any kind of rules. We just have it in
Yeah.
a spreadsheet and we
Yeah.
data load it in, right? And then when new accounts come in, right, they'll probably sit in like a round robin kind of queue, and then they'll be assigned out that way, depending on, okay, this rep owns, like a few reps own San Francisco, so then anything that comes in for San Francisco will just kind of go through this round robin and gets assigned automatically, right? After we do that initial load. But then sometimes at larger companies, we do more nuanced, granular territory rules, right? Which gets a little more complex, right? So you have to build all these rules out. Like I said, if a mayor and US and East Coast and this state and this city, this zip code, right, then it goes to this rep, kind of goes down to that level, or it goes down to like, if employee size is 100 or less than 100, but this industry, but it's in this country, then goes to this rep, so that makes it easier when new accounts come in, assuming the data is populated, right? Then it'll kind of route according to the territory rules that we set for that.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you do get all of your rules down to that granular definition to say that in this scenario, that account's immediately assigned to
Yeah,
sale.
we would have to, right? If you're going to use territory rules and routing, and it kind of makes it easier to kind of like be more hands off to not have like maintain it consistently, right? But then with any examples of automation and consistencies, there's going to be nuances as well, right? So every year there's always going to be like 4,000 accounts that we need to manually route, or because it needs to stay with certain reps or stay with certain regions, right? So nothing's going to be 100%, right? So it really depends on those conversations that you have with your sales leaders on strategically, yes, this account sits with this territory, but we needed to stay with this rep because they have a good relationship with them, right?
Yeah.
Or like stuff like that. There's going to be a whole bunch of
They're neighbors. He's going to sell better to it, kind of thing. It's the
exactly.
exception to every rule. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So then you get down to the assignment. We know that unfortunately the best laid plans are never the way it ends up playing out, right? That you've carved your territories, you've created it, but 2 days later, sales reps leave or whatever. How do you manage the situation? Or maybe you bring in more. But how do you manage that? So now it's like you're throwing your plans out the window. Do you have to redo all those assignment rules? Do you just
Yeah,
reach out to people, or how does that end up working?
I mean, it really depends, right? It's like, like when people leave, is there like a backup headcount that we use? Is it like, are we going to fill it in later on? If not, then we need to basically like recarve that patch to the rest of that team, right? So let's assume that we have a TBD hire, right? After someone leaves, right? Then at that point, we'll keep that territory in place, but we'll have like a coverage rep or the manager would cover for that patch, right? In the meantime, we get someone hired. But let's say like, oh, once someone leaves, we don't have a headcount for it, right? Then we have to like, okay, then now we have to like recarve that patch, right?
Yeah.
How we divvy up that one patch into the other territories we have and expand those more, right? So it really depends on those nuances as well. But from an actual rule standpoint, right? Yeah, having like a coverage rep as a backup or
Okay.
automatically going to the manager is usually the case.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. It would be great, or maybe it would be great, I think, to be that coverage rep. You get double the territory. But
Exactly. Yeah. But
so
also
you
comes back
wouldn't.
to like how efficient they will be working the coverage territory and your own territory, right? So
Yeah, sorry, you mentioned that before. Any ways that you measured or can measure that efficiency of the rep to see like how many accounts could they handle?
um it really depends on like historical activities and the data, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
like every rep will have different um efficiency ratings, right? So, if a rep could handle like 10 account and we say, oh, this is a high performing rep, right? We look at the historical book of business for this rep. Oh, it's only like he had like 50 accounts, but he only really had activities for like maybe like 10 of them, right? So then we know that okay, that he isn't going to have enough bandwidth to handle all 50 accounts. He's only going to have bandwidth to handle 10 of them, right? So I think that's when like the activity tracking gets really important. And you're looking at the historical, okay, yeah, like you can look at the numbers from a rep by rep level, but when you get into the nitty gritty of like their actual bookings number by accounts, right? You see that it's only a handful of accounts that they actually worked on. That that okay, from a efficiency standpoint, they can only handle a certain amount.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Interesting. I love that, because you're exactly right. And it's a constant balance of wanting to make sure that people have enough food to eat, kind of thing, enough of a territory to get to their quota. But at the
yeah,
same time, if you're finding that they're not servicing some of these accounts, and that if you could bring in another rep who could, and you could end up selling more as a business, everyone's going to want to do that. Well, Derrek, thank you so much for joining us here. This has been a pleasure. I've learned a ton. Yeah, and hopefully we can get you back on another time.
yeah, this is great. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate your time.